Hello and welcome to Asian Insider. I'm Ravi, and my guest today is Professor Sumit Ganguly, a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Professor Ganguly is director of the Huntington Program on strengthening US-India relationship, and he is a leading expert in that area. Today, Professor Ganguly and I will be discussing the recent dynamics in the ties between Washington and New Delhi, which are widely seen to have hit severe turbulence in President Donald Trump's second term in office. So, welcome to Asian Insider, Prof. Ganguly.
Thank you very much for having me on the program.
Sumit, could we begin with the latest move by the Pentagon to rename the USIndoPacific Command back to the original Pacific Command? And I saw a recent commentary by Admiral James Stavridis, the former head of NATO forces, and he said that this will go down poorly in New Delhi. What did you make of that name change?
It has already gone down poorly in New Delhi. There has been a significant amount of commentary on the subject by informed journalists and political analysts. The government has mostly maintained a studious silence on the subject, but it is of concern to New Delhi. I know that from having spoken to senior officials, obviously in an anonymous capacity. They are putting up a brave front because they do not want to disturb the relationship any further. But nevertheless, it is a source of unhappiness.
And why do you think the United States did that?
It may be because, in the wake of Trump's visit to Beijing, he wants to signal to Beijing that the US is not going to maintain an adversarial presence in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and that its focus will primarily remain in East Asia, Japan, Taiwan, and the like, but not really in the Indian Ocean littoral. Uh, it, India had been cooperating quite extensively in naval exercises with the United States ever since the 2004 Christmas tsunami. And since then, the band of cooperation had steadily increased over the years across administrations. And in the Trump administration, the Pacific Command had been changed to the Indo-Pacific Command. So this shift uh, probably does signal the reduced importance of India in the maritime domain in the Indian Ocean in particular.
I see. If I'm not mistaken, Prime Minister Narendra Modi was perhaps the fourth world leader to call on Trump after he took office this time. And if you were to use Mr. Modi's visit to the White House in February 2025 as a starting point, how would you describe the relationship and where it is today?
The relationship has suffered a series of body blows ever since about May of 2025, following the terrorist attack, widely believed to be the actions of a organization, an offshoot of a terrorist organization based in Pakistan, the Lashkar-e-Taiba. And in the wake of that, India launched what was a military operation called Operation Sindoor and breached certain previous red lines by striking actually into Pakistani territory, not simply crossing the line of control, the de facto international border in the disputed state of Jammu and Kashmir. And Pakistan, of course, retaliated with considerable force and with assistance now publicly professed by the People's Republic of China. And the intense fighting lasted only for about 4 days. And Trump insisted that it was his threat of the use of tariffs on India and Pakistan that brought the conflict to a close. Indians who are allergic to any notion of foreign intervention in the Kashmir dispute between itself and Pakistan categorically denied that Trump had played any role in dampening tensions and ending the conflict. And in the meanwhile, Pakistan seized upon that moment and said not only had Trump played a critical role, but also nominated him for the Nobel Prize.
Mm-hmm.
Almost immediately thereafter, relations between India and the United States took a precipitously bad turn, with Trump weaponizing uh, tariffs all the way up to 50%, ostensibly because India was buying large amounts of Russian oil. Even when China was buying considerably greater amounts of oil. And since then, there has been Pakistan's growing role in the crisis between Iran, Israel, and the United States, all of which have redounded to India's disadvantage.
Right. Before we come to the recent Iran conflict, Shumit, if I'm not mistaken, the Liberation Day tariffs came before Operation Sindoor in May. Am I not correct in saying that?
Yes, but they significantly increased thereafter, all the way up to 50%, amongst some of the highest in the world. The initial tariff was about 25%.
Yes. It almost seemed vindictive to me. And what's happening here? Because I remember External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar saying just after the election that India expected excellent, less problematic relationship with the Trump administration because of the close interpersonal relationship between Modi and Trump.
This is something that the Indian foreign policy elite had certainly counted upon, than the belief that personal diplomacy would be of extraordinary importance. And also, much of this harked back to Trump's first term, when Modi was greeted with considerable fanfare in Houston with cries of howdy Modi. And by the same token, when Trump came to India and was hosted in Modi's home state of Gujarat, there were similar accolades that greeted Trump. And so there was this belief that this kind of personal chemistry that seemed to have emerged in the first term would spill over into the second term, and that India would not be subjected to sort of a transactional relationship.
Mm-hmm. My mind is going back about 21 years when the Secretary of State of the time, Condi Rice, visited India. And she said publicly that America's policy was to help make India what she called a global power in the 21st century. And she was serving another Republican president, George W. Bush. Is that all in the past now?
I would like to believe that it's not all in the past, that the present situation, while fraught, is an aberration, and that long term interests will bring India and the United States together yet again. Unlike during the Cold War, the today the relationship has significant strength and significant ballast to it. There is uh, a trade relationship, admittedly rather troubled at the moment. There is the relationship between the Indian diaspora in the United States and India. There is India has significantly shifted its defense contracts to the United States and elsewhere from Russia, even though it remains dependent on certain forms of Russian equipment. In addition to that, there is Indian investment in the United States and significant American investment, despite the complaints of American corporations about the difficulties of doing business in India. So there is a foundation to the relationship which has not cracked yet.
That's interesting. I interrupted you when you just began to start talking about Pakistan. And if we could go back to Pakistan, uh, Trump has met twice, if I'm not mistaken, with the Field Marshal, the Pakistani Field Marshal Asim Munir. And he goes around calling him his favorite Field Marshal. Has the U.S. gone back to Pakistan, so to speak, or is all what we are seeing purely something tactical for the moment?
I believe that apart from a certain residual sympathy that exists for Pakistan, both in the State Department and the Department of Defense, amongst the permanent bureaucracy, much of this shift is really located in the White House. A different occupant of the White House is unlikely to continue this seeming embrace of Pakistan.
Mhm.
However, I have it on fairly good authority that there is a group of people in state and another in defense who believe that Pakistan is still an important collaborator for anti-terrorism purposes and also a good um, uh, geographic location for keeping tabs on what transpires in Afghanistan.
Mhm.
So, even with a new administration and new priorities, Pakistan will not completely drop out of the American foreign and security policy firmament.
Mhm.
It is unlikely to have the same kind of stature that it has come to occupy in the last several months.
Mhm. Mhm. You are plugged into New Delhi as much as you're plugged into Washington, D.C. Can you speak a little bit more about how India is reacting to all this?
It has been remarkably muted. And I
Mhm.
commented on this on another recent podcast that in the past, New Delhi would have resorted to fairly harsh and possibly even intemperate language.
Mhm.
On the contrary, there has been almost a deafening silence from New Delhi, except when a number of Indian seafarers were killed in the Strait of Hormuz when tankers, which were flagged under other countries but had Indian crew, were struck by American missiles, and a certain number of Indian seafarers were haplessly killed. It's only then the Ministry of External Affairs issued a fairly anodyne criticism of American actions, but it was by no means intemperate. And at most, they called in the American charge in New Delhi because the American ambassador was out of town at the time. And he was only called in twice in the wake of these attacks on shipping, not Indian shipping, but with Indian seafarers on these ships who ended up either injured or dead.
Right. It's interesting that you speak about India's muted response, Sumit, but I thought this government came to office projecting a certain muscular foreign policy. What is India trying to do here?
Well, the muscular foreign policy has taken a couple of body blows. The first one came from the PRC not long ago during the crisis in the Galwan Valley. And while India did respond to those incursions vigorously, subsequent to that, New Delhi has made cautious efforts to repair relations with the PRC, even though it hasn't been truly reciprocated, barring some sweet words from Beijing. But there have been reports of incursions again in India's northeast, in Arunachal Pradesh. So the Chinese are not letting up on the pressures on the Himalayan border by any means. And so there is hardly any muscularity there.
Mhm.
And in terms of the United States, India at this point is so vulnerable, and the Trump administration is so mercurial that it has not displayed any gumption in terms of dealing with the US.
Hmm. Hmm. You said that India is so vulnerable, but surely New Delhi must hold some cards. After all, it is a nation of 1.4, 1.5 billion people and a big economy and growing very fast. And it cannot be totally helpless and remain just a price taker.
No, but that would entail significant domestic costs.
Hmm.
Take, for example, oil. India imports more than 80% of its hydrocarbons from the Persian Gulf region. And while it has sought to diversify its sources of supply, they are limited, particularly because of Trump's highly idiosyncratic behavior. And this is a significant pressure point for India.
Hmm.
And then there is still the threat of bilateral tariffs. Political scientists in the 1970s, particularly the late Joseph Nye,
Hmm.
coined a term called vulnerability interdependence. And this is a form of vulnerability interdependence
I see.
that because India is tied to the global marketplace and particularly to the United States in certain crucial areas, it is actually vulnerable to American pressure.
I see. I see. I get that. Now, you spoke about China a moment ago. Is this an opportunity for China to improve the India relationship? Or do you think that relationship has too many constraints that prevent it from truly flowering?
China will use India in a purely tactical fashion. It will rely on India for particular transient moments. But as long as India can sustain a certain level of economic growth and does not get bogged down with internal conflicts or becomes acutely vulnerable to exogenous shocks, the PRC will continue to see India as a potential impediment to the realization of its dominance in Asia. That Russia is a declining power. The US is far away and increasingly mercurial, at least under Trump. And so the only long term impediment to the realization of Xi Jinping's
Mm,
dream
mm.
of Asian dominance is actually uh, uh, being held back by India.
I see. Just to go back to India again, what is it that New Delhi does not understand, or what does it misunderstand about America today? That did it get something wrong, or is everything tilted because of the uncertainties coming out of the White House, as you indicated?
Certainly, the uncertainties coming out of the White House have not helped matters.
Mhm.
But that, as a colleague of mine at Hoover just said the other day in the corridor, he said, I was lamenting the state of US India relations, and he said, tell me a part of the world with whom we have good relations at the moment. It was a bit of a sardonic remark on his part, but not entirely off the mark.
Mhm.
Where I think India erred was first in believing that the personal relationship between Modi and Trump would overcome any other issue.
Mhm.
That's the first one.
Mhm.
The second, India could have been a little more deft on the tariffs. This is an issue that goes back to the time of George W. Bush, when Ambassador Robert Blackwell, who was the ambassador to New Delhi, had referred to Indo US trade as flat as a chapati.
Yes, it's in my book as
The
well.
flat, unleavened bread that
Right.
millions of Indians
That's
consume.
right. Yeah.
And that had not significantly changed. And knowing Trump's obsession with the trade deficit, India could have displayed a bit of dexterity on that
Right.
front. And
Right.
finally, India should not have been so rigid on the Kashmir issue.
Right.
They could have come up with some anodyne formulation saying our American friends certainly facilitated a reduction in tensions,
Right.
or some such formulation, instead of getting on its high horse and insisting that Trump played no role whatsoever.
Right. Right. I get that. Do you think New Delhi today is playing what you might call a waiting game, in the sense that they're just waiting for Trump to leave the scene, that eventually the United States has little option but to resume wooing India if it needs any say in the Indian Ocean ultimately?
I think so. And that might in part explain India's reticence to say anything that could possibly further upset the apple cart.
Mhm.
That this may well explain India's uh, willingness to avoid any confrontation or use any language that could inflame sentiments in Washington,
Right.
and a willingness to continue negotiating with the trade representative Jameson Greer and insist that a trade deal is near.
Hmm. I see. A final question for you. If you were advising the U.S. administration, what would be your top 3 priorities for India policy?
My top three priorities would be to stop pressuring India on the issue of hydrocarbons, of letting them purchase oil wherever they can from. Second, some form of reassurance to India, perhaps even through, quiet diplomatic channels, that the rehyphenation is not about to occur with Pakistan. And third, to give India some break on the H-1B visa issue, which affects thousands and thousands of Indian professionals, because ultimately it's these professionals right here in Silicon Valley who have contributed significantly to America's growth and bounty.
Mhm. So the H-1B visa has been a hit, uh, a self-inflicted wound for the United States, and an exogenous wound on India as well. So it's hit both people. Is that what you'd say?
Oh, absolutely. It's been quite painful for India, and the US, to use an old expression, is cutting off its own nose to spite its face.
Hmm. Hmm. I see. Professor Ganguly, that has been a Most interesting conversation, and you've given us wonderful insights on a very critical relationship. Thank you very much for coming on Asian Insider.
Thank you so much for having me on your program. It's been a pleasure.
And that's a wrap for Asian Insider. I'm Ravi Veloor. Don't forget to share this podcast with your friends and family. And if you'd like to read my articles, we have links in our podcast show notes below. You can also sign up for our Asian Insider newsletter. This episode was produced and edited by Faiza Sani. Thank you for joining us.